Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Reinsurance Podcast. I am your co-host, Jared Lee.
And I'm the other one. Hello, everyone.
who shall remain nameless in
I
this
figured
episode.
they figured it out by now.
They do, yeah. I was thinking the other day, I was talking to some people about like favorite podcasts and things, and how you first get into podcasts. And I think because of when we started, most of our podcasts were streamed on YouTube, and we have like the LinkedIn stuff, so people know us. But we were talking about when you see the two hosts of a podcast, and then you're trying just from the image to go like, whose voice is whose?
Oh, yeah.
Right. And I'm wondering how many people they saw like our photos would go, which one is which? Like, I'm keen to like do a bit of a survey, especially do a live podcast. Like, raise your hand if you thought that one was Ben.
I mean, there's also almost definitely enough video content out there for Cordy, if he feels like it, and has suddenly lots of free time to produce a like voice switched version, right, where you could overlay my voice over your mouth moving, and vice versa.
We should do it just to wind people up.
See it just for my own morbid curiosity.
Yeah. So stay tuned for the April Fool's episode of 2024.
Yeah. Wowza.
Speaking of voice transfiguration, this is a good segue.
It is.
So one of the most popular requests we've gotten from listeners is to dive into the topic of sort of reputational risk, how the insurance industry sort of presents itself to protect against it, but also sort of how it sort of is presented in our industry, how our industry thinks about reputational risk. But when I was thinking about it, I sort of saw it as sort of two categories. You have the reputational risk of a firm, like a big brand, a Coca-Cola or Twitter or X, as it's now called. But also you have the reputational risk and threats of an individual, sort of this key person risk, in Elon Musk character or Mark Zuckerberg character, similar. That's kind of how I started thinking about what are we solving for? Like, what is the thing that we're trying to protect against? And then we can go into sort of how the insurance industry like lends itself to provide solutions and support this sort of dynamic.
Absolutely. And it's a really fun one because, I mean, not because of this. Partly because of this, I suppose, but the fact that the industry has not been able to fully meet the full needs of customers worried about reputational risk has made it like one of those always trying but never fully achieved sort of product areas, which is quite fun. I remember Aon, and I'm sure a bunch of others as well, I published quite regularly these surveys and reports where they interview all of their clients, sort of risk managers, and say, what's your top 10 risks right now? And every year they could produce a huge aggregated report, and quite frequently reputation would be up there near the top as one of the risks, not only that was keeping them up at night the most, but also one of the ones they felt was the least protected by insurance. And similarly, I think it was, they made some cool tables and things where it'd be like insurable or like insured, and then another one would be not insured, and then there'd be not enough insured. And typically reputation fell into that category. You could get some basic types of kind of crisis response product, but a lot of the potential reputational financial loss in particular and long-term potential opportunity cost, I guess, of reputational damage was something that felt you could not insure against.
So I think it's hard. It's harder for, and I think the reason it's on the top of these sort of concern lists is in the current world we live in with the scope of social media and the impact it has on society and the ease by which news gets shared and circulated. The risk you have of like something going sideways and then everybody knowing about it is very, very different than it would have been 10 or 15 years ago. So the risk has been elevated. So as a brand, and certain brands can lean into character, right? You see, they can be quite provocative with their advertising or their labeling, and they're leaning into having more of an expression of who they are and what they stand for. But other brands, specifically our industry, can't really have that same voice. Like you're not going to get provocative ads from an insurer because our brands stand for stability and longevity and robustness and all of these sort of imagery, this sort of imagery that it would present. Where you look at consumer brands, there's a lot more willingness to sort of lean into what you stand for, whether and then whether that gets picked up and supported by the market is kind of the risk that they're taking there.
Well, I think this is probably why it's such a risky topic as well, is that you have, on one hand, generic business activities and, you know, what you do as business as usual that could cause you a reputational risk. You know, like something happens that means there's an irregularity in your finances that then damages your reputation, or an employee goes a bit rogue and does something wrong in a way that's sufficiently public to your customers or similar that affects your revenue. But then there's like this next tier where if you're a brand rather than a company that has a name, you know, like if you're perpetuating quite a strong brand image, typically that means you're proactively trying to engage with your clients, your customers, and to make them feel a certain way or to make them react a certain way to something you put in front of them. So in a weird way, there's also a huge degree of moral hazard here, because you're if you're able to insure against the reputational risk, you're going to do more risky things, which is going to increase the risk that you need that insurance. Like if I know I'm insured for sponsoring a particularly controversial, you know, celebrity with my brand, then I'm more likely to do it. Whereas if I'm not insured, I'm probably going to pick a very safe celebrity that is non-controversial.
Yeah, you can lean into that higher risk, high reward celebrity, knowing that there's a safety net if it all goes sideways.
But isn't that what insurance is for? I guess
in many ways,
time,
yeah,
yeah, allowing you to take a bit of a gamble.
Well, and I think when you see that, you'll look at the brands who have that freedom, and they will lean into their social sort of distribution channels more, right? They'll have quite snarky Twitter back and forths, and they'll have, you know, these kind of things because they're allowed to do that in a way that other brands maybe not so. But when you look at like an organization, and you are a bit more familiar with the various products available, you have the reputational risk of if your CEO is, convicted of fraud. You know, so you'll have board level like products that protect against like something very, very serious there. But are there also products that sort of exist going like, what happens if there's a story a few years ago, I think now, but one of your employees like sends off a racist tweet and then gets on an international flight, and when they land 6 hours later, like Twitter's blown up and you're having to fire this. It's like this whole spectacle. Like, is there products that protect a brand against like the rogue behavior of employees, and how might those be positioned, or is that one of those product gaps that you were sort of referencing?
So in a rare, not first, but in a rare instance, I did do some research prior to this episode. I went looking to see, you know, what reputational insurance can you buy, and to your point, you can buy some things, but it's actually interesting. It's arguable that it's not insurance as such, in the sense of, because reputation, as they say, takes a lifetime to build and, you know, moments to ruin, or words to that effect. It's very difficult to indemnify somebody who's had a reputational loss, to put them back in the place they were in previously. You can't unsay things that have been said or undo things that have been done. That's now part of your reputation. So what insurance companies can do is to pay for services. So this is a really popular approach, to know that you have on call a 24/7 crisis management hotline with experts who can sweep in and go, okay, next step, you've got to get a press release out that says this. You've got to launch, X investigation to go and figure out what's going on. So that's a very popular part that most insurers seem to offer, some kind of partnership with a specialist team that can do something about it for you. It's actually reminded me of like kidnap and ransom insurance and these kind of lines, where, and cyber to some extent.
Cyber, and that was what jumped to mind.
The most valuable thing in a way is, you're not going to be able to get back the thing that you've lost necessarily with money, or it's even questionable whether you should. It's almost, you need a specialist team that's going to go in and do hostage negotiations or, extract a person that's been, who knows. The other thing that I've seen from a quick look around is that there are a few insurers who will actually offer the financial loss aspect of reputational damage. And what they try to do there is they look at various trigger points. Has an identifiable like single event happened within some parameters, are they able to then trace that event directly to changes in revenue and sort of map a loss of revenue whilst indexing that against other factors like, broader economic environment, seasonality, etc. So you're not like, oh, our sales went down in the months from September to November versus June to August, and it must be because, I don't know, Jenny has been writing unpopular things on social media. They'll be like, no, you're an ice cream salesman, that's why your sales that's the kind of thing they have to manage for, is trying to isolate specifically how much of your revenue that you lost was due to that event. And I think that's always been a challenge for customers, is knowing to what extent the burden of proof is on them to show that it was because of that event, because it's very, very hard to prove.
Yeah. Well, and similar to things like cyber loss, being able to then point to, this is the reason, you like quantifying and monetizing in many ways what that loss is. And that's very, very tricky. And I think historically, when we think about this as a product, you'd think mostly about celebrities and politicians and these types of things. But more and more frequently, and I think because of the way brands get presented in the media, you're getting it where brand leadership is like things you want to associate with those individuals. Even if you look at brand engagement, oftentimes the heads of those firms have more followers or more engagement than the firms themselves in more of these channels. So you're seeing more companies put their leadership in front of the public to drive that engagement. But it does open up a different channel in which there's this exposure now to a class of individuals who may have been protected previously. They weren't movie stars or politicians who had this sort of naturally public profile, but they've been brought up now to have it, which carries a bigger weight against and a risk against their firms.
Yeah, we've put them on a pedestal, haven't we?
Yeah.
In some ways, there's this new very high expectations of conduct and all sorts of things in that sphere. And you made me think, actually, interestingly, a lot of the leaders then become a sort of focal point for discussion of company behavioral issues that are actually also at the corporate level, because they're deemed to have the role of deciding sort of the corporation's attitude towards certain things.
Yep.
And it means that I've actually seen in a few of the products advertised as well, a lot of reputational risk is now being positioned closely to ESG as well. So you have this balance between, on one hand, it's about what that CEO says in Twitter, but also what they publish in their financial results at the end of the year, but also the claims they make about their ESG targets and the gender pay gap and the achievement of fossil fuel reduction and investment, etc. All sorts of things which have a ton of different stakeholder groups to manage, activists and so on that might get involved and pick on different parts of the company to engage with. So it's a minefield, I think, for these firms. Rightly so, some might say.
Well, and this is, I think, the impact of a much more connected social network-driven environment that we're in, is any fringe group with a belief against a cause or for a cause or whatever it might be can cherry pick a thing in your financial statement that irritates them for whatever misalignment to the cause that they particularly care about. Yeah. And just like that, you've got protesters outside your office for a thing that you maybe didn't really consider or think about in great depth. And so I think it's increasingly difficult to navigate, because you're trying to have a lens on sort of like all topics that humans care about, and in many ways have a position, even though like it might not even remotely align to what your company does. But if you've not made a stance against this issue in this country, you might get pushback for even though you sell water or something, right?
And I think it's figuring out the role for insurance here must be very hard, because you've got a balance of known risks that you're taking and sort of unknown risks that you're taking. So all of a sudden you could find yourself in a crisis for an issue you didn't know was bubbling away in the background, or you were unaware of your company's importance with respect to X narrative.
Yeah.
But then you have some known risks that you take, like when you say, right, we want to back this celebrity, or we want to similarly, I don't know, sponsor a event or a sports team, or who knows what it would be. And I wonder how different that conversation is when you sit down with an insurer and you say, we want to do this. We think this decision could impact our reputation. It could be a massive success, in which case great, or it could, be an absolute disaster and tank our brand. We saw, for example, one well-covered beer company, and I can't remember which one it was now. So I won't name them just in case I get it wrong, but they decided to go in the US with a big campaign with a transgender rights activist of some kind. And that led to, on one hand, support from some groups, and then entire states at the other that then seem to, in the US, reject this brand all of a sudden and start some huge boycotting campaigns and all sorts, right? And you've got to imagine, did they sit down before that whole process and say, with their insurers, this could go one of two ways. We could emerge as the people's champion and resonate with current thinking, or we could alienate, a huge part of the population that thinks differently. But by choosing to say anything or have a voice at all, you're always taking a risk there. So I guess that partnership angle with insurers is critical.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's this balance then of sort of being authentic and virtue signaling.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Right. So in many ways, and again, I think it lends itself better to consumer brands, but in many ways, I think it's good for brands to kind of say, this is what we care about and what we stand for. And there's this buzzword now around it, maybe more in the US than it is here in England, but there's a buzz around cancel culture and things, which I think is kind of a lazy way to describe something. I think in many ways you're saying, well, I believe this thing, and if a bunch of people disagree with me, they have every right in the world to say, well, I'm just not going to buy your product. And if I've done something so egregious that literally no one wants to buy my product ever again, okay, I've made a big mistake there. But we're sort of saying people can vote with their money. Yeah. And it's like, oh, you back a cause that I don't agree with, I can choose to purchase a competing brand or not buy something, and that's just the economic instead of the invisible hand at work.
Yeah. And hence the strong relationship with the ESG angles, right?
Correct.
But what does your company stand for?
Yeah, but the other thing that's happening there is there's this real challenge of our companies doing enough, and that's another one where they're saying, well, we're going to make this step to do the right thing, and then you equally get people coming out and going, you're not doing enough. You're like, we're trying. Right?
I mean, that could arguably be not an event, right, as well.
Right.
You're trying to put that into an insurance contract. What is the event? Well, it's actually a non-event.
Yeah.
The fact that we didn't champion this movement or make a statement on this cause or similar has cost us. You look at climate change, it's a massive obvious one. If you look at Black Lives Matter, if you look at some of the war in Ukraine, for example, taking the latter, even recently, I remember seeing, I think it was Unilever, I want to say, but apologies again to the Unilever Corporation if I've misnamed you. Recently, a large, fast-moving consumer goods provider that still has a presence in Russia that's kind of stuck there has come under a lot of pressure from external stakeholders because they haven't sort of disbanded, but they pointed out it's really complicated. Basically, if we leave, then the state will just take over all of our people and our gear and rebrand and carry on without us. At least we've got a smidgen of control if we stay in. So it's all sorts of complicated non-event type things that could also be a trigger for people getting angry at your company and not buying your stuff anymore.
Well, and I think what's also become popular for a lot of brands is it's almost now every month of the year has a thing it stands for, whatever. Yeah. But it's like, oh, we'll change the colors of our logo to reflect the Ukrainian flag, or it's like, or what are you doing to support these? Like, oh, nothing. But we changed our company logo to be a rainbow this month, or a Ukrainian flag for the support. And it's good to show you have support for those causes. But are you doing anything, or is it just you're trying to say thumbs up, guys? That feels so empty. And I think there's this need for brands to have authenticity, but people are inherently, everyone has an opinion on everything now, which is fair, and they should have that right. But as brands need to lean into authenticity, it opens up a huge sort of target space for people to come in and attack them at all manner. So it's like
I think that's
a
why
very sharp two-sided sword that we're dealing with now.
I agree, and I think that's probably why it's ended up moving almost away from the brands and towards these big personalities. Like,
Yeah.
you know, this inseparable identity now between Zuckerberg and Facebook. Whatever, Meta,
Yeah.
and Musk and Twitter and
Yeah.
X or SpaceX and all the various.
Yeah.
I, by the way, as a complete aside, the fact that he's going with the X brand just sets up such a beautiful kind of alphabet versus the missing letter X scenario one day. But anyway, I'm sure the media will cotton onto that at some point. But these kind of cult personalities are maybe useful and maybe easier to insure than the whole brand itself, right? Because you've got a full person, you've got a level of distance that you can create. You know, the views of the person expressed there are solely the private views of that person and not the views of the corporation.
Yeah. Which I think the thing that feels really strange with Twitter and X now is like the absolute like chaos in which it's being run. Like they instituted a rebrand. Like they asked people to submit logos online and then picked one on a Sunday night and changed it on Monday. Like half the site is still in Twitter and blue and the bird and everything, and the other half is like this very haphazard. It's just when you look at how when you look at compared to the Facebook Meta transition, it was super buttoned up. There's a massive release that had a brand new logo. The whole thing switched in an hour, and it was all like very tightly done. It's like, and then Elon Musk is there just like, well.
So you raised something important here, which is also you look at the law of defamation, for example. There's a defense, which is truth. To what extent is reputational damage insurable against in the scenario where it's untrue versus when it's kind of based on fact, right?
Yeah.
Like people are buying our products because they think they break all the time. Well, do they break all the time?
Yeah.
You know, or like people have accused us of very publicly of this thing. And it's like, well, is it true? It's like, well, maybe.
Yeah.
Like, how can you insure, or to what extent can you insure against? I think I may have seen actually some of the wordings they talked about. Pre-crisis and post-crisis, and it reminds me of another form of insurance actually, that the legal expenses type insurances.
Oh yeah.
Where there's like you can buy legal protection pre somebody suing you.
Yeah.
In which case it's like just in case somebody sues you, and you can also buy it like somebody's just told me they're going to sue me, and the costs could be huge, but we don't know.
And now,
which is then like after the event kind of insurance instead. But I presume it must be similar reputational damage wise, right? Like it has to be fortuitous.
Yeah.
You know, there has to be an unexpected thing that we can both gamble on, probably not happening, but just in case it does. But if you go in with we know that this is a problem already, we think it could cause us damage, we just don't know how much damage, then it's much more of an after the event kind of coverage, I guess.
Yeah. Well, if we turn the lens then to our industry and how the insurance and reinsurance and broking communities sort of think about their own reputations and the risks that they face and how they mitigate against those, because the thing that they're protecting in the imagery that they're trying to protect or retain in many ways is this idea that they're there for the long haul, they're really stable, they're secure, they're trusted, all these types of things. And in many ways, for the insurers, the most important reputation that they can have is, do they pay their claims, right? The reason reinsurance in many ways exists is to help protect them against that reputational risk of going, hang on, those guys don't pay claims. And so they use the reinsurance sort of vehicle as a way to ensure that they always can have the capital needed to protect against the most fundamental of reputational damages that they have. When you look at the individuals in our space, you also have big personalities and brands, and protecting their reputations is because they also not only represent the firms that they are currently at, but those brands carry weight and they carry power. You look at the rise of Convex or the McGill Group as they've sort of grown out. Like, yeah, you took people who had great reputations and had a history of a track record of success. When they spin out and do something new, they attract talent, they attract capital, and that scales up very, very quickly. So you are trying to protect against those sort of near-term objectives and sort of growth and long-term ambitions as well.
Yeah, and it's funny. I think you made the point that you're looking for brands when you're looking for an insurer that are reliable, there for the long term, etc. It is funny. It must be quite restrictive in some ways for those brands as a whole who want to have a bit of an identity or a bit of a nuance about them, because at the end of the day, companies that or individuals that want to buy insurance, it's like, who am I going to trust to look after my children? Or, who am I going to give lots of my money to with the hope of being able to get it back from them when I want, right? You want to give it to that reliable, stable person who you can depend upon, not the person who's like more at the risky end of the spectrum, who does lots of dangerous activities and keeps company with people who sit on the wrong side of the law.
Well, and in to that vein, that's exactly why our brands are so like dry at many times. Like,
I think so. It's like,
and not to hurt any
reassuringly boring.
and not to hurt anyone's feelings if they're listeners, but like if you manage the like social media accounts for like an insurance company, it's probably not the most like you're not running it for like a dynamic consumer brand that's very cheeky. It has this personality. It's like, here is my very tedious, but that's the brand you're representing and protecting, is that kind of like, look at me, I'm just all reliable.
And it does become very scripted and very kind of. So what? I think even to the point where that goes beyond public and like socials and all that sort of thing, like and disclosure, even to the point where you have like your reinsurer meetings and things, right? And the cedent is sort of toured around by the broker who introduces them to all the underwriters again for their annual sit down. And both sides come with, like, even if they meet externally outside of this formal sit down conversation and they talk about all their gossip on the sides, for this formal meeting they've got like a formal script that they all take turns to read off.
Here are the talking
they've almost like rehearsed before the real meeting. So like, yes, we have had a very good year, thank you. Sorry, that was on a new line. We have recruited this new person, which means that the company will be especially profitable. Something about EBITDA. Please reinsure us.
Well, and I think when you look at, and that permeates across the engagement of I think the reason you have the publications in our industry that get so much attention and so much interest is that they're covering like the gossip and the what's happening underneath or behind the scenes, behind the curtain. And I think the reason that's those publications are so appealing is because if you just let our industry just give you the press releases and they suck out anything of interest because they don't want to be too contentious. They want it to be boring and stable. And the same thing with, can you comment to our white papers? It's like, well, let me get the PR team's approval for a thing, and we're going to strip out anything that would have added some additional color for fear it might accidentally cause. There's this risk aversion that happens. So you get this, here are the pre-approved press releases from our PR team that we can say does this thing.
It's interesting, right? If you think, especially in our space, because the consumer insurers at least can have a little bit of fun. They can sponsor, sports stadiums and all, as they often do. And they do TV ads, and they can be a bit humorous with those, etc. But in the commercial space, you probably have a brand aspiration, which is like, we want to be really famous, but like, but what for? And it's like, well, nothing that's going to really be something to write home about, to be honest. That's just famous for being good at the same thing everyone else is good at. We just want to be in the list of famous at being good insurance companies or reinsurers or brokers, etc. I think some of them have succeeded in choosing an attribute or a couple of attributes that they particularly excel in, but maybe at the expense of others. Others we're great at everything. But it must be hard to define your brand values.
And so these are the things when I was sort of thinking about this topic more broadly, like I think the meandering of this conversation sort of shows like all the nuance of where you have products, where you have risk, and then how companies, if there's no product that really exists there, how they then build in structural protection against like, oh, well, we won't allow these things to go out unless it gets pre-approved here, because if something goes sideways, like it just is going to crush, kill our premium volumes or reputation, whatever that might be. And sure, we could get a PR agency or whatever the firms are that put the fires out to come in and support that. In many ways, the damage has been done, and so they're needing to sort of manage that. I think we'll talk about it when we do the news later, but this is the reason this Vestu story is getting so much interest for those who are following it, is because it's threatening like one of the core foundational things you're trying to protect against, this reputation of we will be there to pay your claims. And we've set up all these complex instruments to guarantee we'll be there to pay the claims in our client. And very, very quickly it's gone, that might not always be true.
Yeah.
And just like that, the whole industry went, what? And did like the sort of strain your neck double take, right? And I think that's why that story, which is gaining that sort of interest, is because it's potentially breaking the most fundamental reputational risk that this industry protects itself against.
Yeah, absolutely. But we'll save that.
Let's save
for an upcoming news roundup.
To watch for the July news roundup for that one.
Yeah.
What an episode.
Although actually we might publish the July news before this episode comes out. So we hope you enjoyed.
In which case,
listening to the July news roundup.
Thank you from the future.
Yeah, faster release cycle on the news ones. Enjoy both, whatever you do.
Yeah, exactly. Hit play, hit and skip to go to the next episode of the Reinsurance Podcast.
See you next time.
See you next time.